Welcome back. We're going to continue our lecture on ancient Israel. Last time we ended with the Jews being sent into exile, both to the Assyrian nation and the Babylonian nation. Now we're going to talk about what life was like for God's people while they were in exile. So I hope you have your lecture notes and a pencil and that you're ready to go. I also want to remind you that if you have any questions, go ahead and write them down as you're listening to the lecture, and then when you have a chance, you can always ask me your questions, because I do miss with these video lectures that we can't ask and answer questions. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first question is, who were the Samaritans? The Samaritans were Israelites who were left in the land of Israel and who intermarried with other conquered peoples who moved into the land of Israel after the nation of Israel was destroyed. These people were not liked at all by the full-blooded Israelites, and the Samaritans were viewed as less than the full-blooded Jews were. We'll be coming back to this definition of Samaritans in a few minutes. Why did some Jews decide not to return to Judah? So after Israel and after the tribes of Judah and Benjamin had been in captivity for a period of time, they were allowed to come back to Judah. But some Jews didn't want to. The reason is because they had made a home for themselves in Babylon. They were comfortable in the land of Babylon, and they didn't want to change. Our next question is, how did King Xerxes' choice to marry Queen Esther affect the Jews? Honestly, the Jews would have been destroyed if Queen Esther had not chosen to stand up for her people and let King Xerxes know that the Jews were her people. The nation that Queen Esther ruled over was Persia. When Queen Esther was married to King Xerxes, she ruled over the nation of Persia. Queen Esther ruled over Persia. What holiday do the Jews celebrate because of Esther? Every year, the Jews celebrate the holiday of Purim. Purim is spelled P-U-R-I-M. Every year, the Jews celebrate Purim because of Queen Esther. Every year, the Jews celebrate Purim. Now I said that you would be seeing the definition for the Samaritans again. Well, here it is. Make sure you jot this down in your notes. So the Samaritans were descendants of Jews who intermarried with Gentiles. So what that means is that one parent was Jewish and one parent was not. One parent was a Gentile. And then their children would be called Samaritans. Samaritans, descendants of Jews who intermarried with Gentiles. Okay, it's time for some dig and drill questions. When the kingdom was divided, blank ruled Israel and blank ruled Judah. So we're looking for the names of the first two kings, the first king of Israel and the first king of Judah. We went over this pretty in depth in the last lecture. So Jeroboam ruled in Israel. Jeroboam was an advisor to King Solomon. And Rehoboam ruled in Judah. And Rehoboam was the son of King Solomon. Next dig and drill question. In 722 BC, Israel was conquered by... The correct answer is the Assyrian Empire. Israel was conquered by Assyria. Judah was conquered by Babylon. All right, we're going to go a little bit further now. So the Jews have returned from exile in the lands where they were sent to live, and now they're back living in the land of Israel. But it's not called Israel anymore. It's called Judea. So now let's take a look at our focus questions. How did Antiochus IV respond to the rebellion in Jerusalem? Antiochus IV was very upset when he realized that the Jews had revolted against him, and he tore down the city walls, placed idols in the temple, and sacrificed pigs on the altar of God. If you know anything about Israel, you know that they don't like pigs. They don't eat pig. So no ham, no pork, no bacon. And so sacrificing pigs on the altar of God was a huge sacrilege. It was a terrible thing to do. And the Jews were very upset when Antiochus did this. Next question. Why is Hanukkah celebrated? Hanukkah is celebrated to remember the cleansing and rededication of Jerusalem after Antiochus IV did all of those terrible things. Now we're going to be moving in to talk about the Greeks. As you read in your textbook, after the Jews returned to Judea, eventually Persia and Greece went and fought against each other. When we get to the next chapter that we cover about Greece, we'll learn a little bit more about this period. So the Greeks come through and they make Israel part of their kingdom. So our first question here is, how do we know the Jews were ready to follow God when they returned to their homeland after captivity? So we're rewinding just a little bit to before the Greeks take over Judea. And we know that the Jews were ready to follow God because the prophets rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the walls around the Jerusalem, which says that they were willing to now worship God instead of worshiping idols. When the Greeks took over, Judea got stuck in between the rule of two different kingdoms. Which two kingdoms? Judea was located between Syria, which is in the north of Judea, and Egypt. You know where Egypt is. We've seen it on our maps. It's to the south of Judea. When these two kingdoms fought, Judea got stuck in the middle. And so they were continually being attacked and stuck in the middle, and sometimes they would belong to Syria, sometimes they would belong to Egypt. Now, during this time, why did some of the Jews insist on a strict observance of the law? They wanted the Jews to very strictly obey the law because they didn't want the Jews to lose their culture. They didn't want the Jews to assimilate or become like the Greeks who had conquered their land. Once the Jews returned from exile and the Greeks took over their land, the Jews stopped talking Hebrew and they started to talk Greek instead. We already mentioned that when the Jews returned from exile, they rebuilt the temple and they started worshiping God the way that they were supposed to. If you remember back to the last lecture, you'll remember that the Jews got sent into exile because they had stopped worshiping God the way that they were supposed to. Several Jews were transferred from the land of Judea down to Egypt, to a city called Alexandria. And while they were there were several Jews that translated the Bible from Hebrew to Greek. There's a special name for this translation, and that's called the Septuagint. The Septuagint translated the Bible from Hebrew to Greek. The Septuagint is the translation of the Bible from Hebrew to Greek. The Septuagint helped the Jews because, like I mentioned, many of them were no longer speaking Hebrew. They didn't know the language that their Bible was in. So by translating the Bible from Hebrew to Greek, the Septuagint made the Bible in the language that the people could understand. This is very important. We're going to spend just a moment reviewing Antiochus V. Antiochus V was an extremely evil, wicked man. He did many bad things. And one thing that he did that really upset the Jews, we already mentioned a little earlier in this time. Antiochus V stole treasures and sacred holy vessels from the temple. Then he tore down the city's walls because the Jews had rebelled against him. So in punishment, he destroyed their city. And then remember what I said. Antiochus also made the Jews sacrifice pigs on their altar. Remember, if you're Jewish, pigs are unclean. They are not something that you want to associate with. And sacrificing pigs on God's altar made God's altar unclean, which made the Jews very, very upset, because during this time they were really trying to follow God's laws and obeyed the laws that Moses had sent them. Those weren't the only things that Antiochus IV did. He also put idols in the temple of God. He outlawed reading the Torah, which is the Jewish Bible, and he killed any Jews who tried to worship on the Sabbath. Fortunately, there was a group of people who rose up against Antiochus IV and overthrew him. But you'll have to wait until next time in order to find out more about that group of people.